Welcome everyone to another entry in the Hyrule Compendium. Mas, you and I, at the at the ZDI Marathon this year, we both competed in the Royal Rumble.
Yep.
I think we now have good perspective on this. It's very fresh in our mind. Vortex Hornet wanted us to just discuss the dungeons in Twilight Princess. Now we could do a whole series on this. We can at least, with our very recent memory, kind of cover our overall opinion of them.
You know, years back, we actually did a ZD Tops where, like, all the staff members ranked their 9 dungeons from 1 to 9. And I ranked Lakebed Temple as my favorite dungeon. Probably my favorite water-themed dungeon. There's not actually that much swimming going on. I like that center room with the spinning staircase. It could get frustrating a little bit sometimes, like especially on repeat playthroughs where you know you have to turn the staircase, but you can't think which way you have to do it. But the puzzles can all be solved like logically a little bit. Like, all right, we got water over here, we need to get to this side, we need to turn the staircase this way and get the water to flow. And it's one of those dungeons where you revisit a lot of the same rooms, but after water flow is coming to that room, there's different mechanisms that are now working. Or sometimes when the water level has risen, then there's new mechanics that you can now reach. I think it was a very well done dungeon. It had a great mini boss. It had a boss-like feel to him, even though he was a mini boss. And then the final boss with more feel, I believe. Not the greatest boss, but it was still a good one. Yeah, that's my favorite dungeon in Twilight Princess. But generally speaking, I think Twilight Princess, outside maybe like, I don't know, the Temple of Time, that might be the oddball one. I think they did a good job with all of the dungeons being very thematic, because they were totally different from one another. Like their actual settings. Like
You don't think Temple of Time was?
That was more generic, I think. Whereas, you know, the Forest Temple's kind of generic too, but it's a forest. But then fire, you know, they used fire elements for the Goron mines, and the water, there was, you know, Arbor's Ground was like a sand-based. This has been a tradition in the Zelda series for a while. Twilight Princess did it quite well.
I also think they did a good job of contextualizing all the dungeons as to why they even existed.
Okay.
You know, the Goron mines were mines, and they do that in other games, but I think this one was even stronger in doing that. Like,
right.
There was story around them. We've talked in previous videos about like the story they tell within the dungeon, but I think all the characters outside of the dungeon kind of have some sort of relationship with the dungeon that actually makes sense.
In a lot of other Zelda games, there's like a dungeon that you don't exactly know why that dungeon is there. What context does it have in the game? It's like, oh, let's put 7 dungeons in this game, so let's put something over here. I like you know, like you meet like the Aku, or whatever they are, and then you find out that like that's where they live, and that's where they are.
Yeah, you're just like in their city. It's a weird city, but you're there.
They have a shop and they sell stuff to you.
That's cool too. The shop is in the dungeon.
Yeah, so what were some of your favorite dungeons in that?
We might be in agreement that most of them feel kind of linear.
Generally speaking, I think so.
I'd still say overall most of them are pretty fun, despite that. One of my favorite ones that feels a little less like that, even though you're told where to go for a while, is Snow Peak Mansion.
Right. That's probably the least linear of the group. You actually have to go on a certain path, but there's a lot of exploration in that dungeon.
But the first part, they're like, go over here. Go over here.
They literally pan to the room and says, go through that door.
After a little bit of doing that, you can actually get kind of lost in there.
Yeah.
Especially if you miss the key that you have to dig
more
than once for.
Right, yeah. There's a lot of optional rooms, too. I like the setting. It's very odd for a Zelda game. It's like a regular house. I can't think of any other, like, other than like Hyrule Castle, where it's like a, you know, somewhere where people live is the dungeon.
And it's another one where it's like you're not in just some weird labyrinth, you're in an actual setting.
I like the 2 characters too, the Yeti and Yeto. I don't even remember their names. The male, the big guy, his facial reactions are just hilarious every time you give him something to put in his soup. He like knocks you over just to take your pumpkin.
You know, I like the story of you meet him. He's like, come with me. Brings you there. See his wife's sick. You're helping him with a soup to give to his wife. And at the very end, you actually have to fight her. And then they make up at the end.
They hug it out,
yeah.
and hearts come all over the place. It's a good dungeon. It's a great dungeon. I think Twilight Princess has such a good diversity of dungeons.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's one of the games that, when people think of Twilight Princess, I think they immediately jump to the dungeons, too. It's because it's such a central... they're long dungeons, too. They're not... like, the shortest dungeon's probably, I don't know, the Goron Mines, or maybe the Palace of Twilight, and that's like a half-hour dungeon.
I like that the first dungeon, it takes a minute to get there, but for a first dungeon, it's pretty dense when I think of inside the Deku Tree.
The Deku Tree, or even the Eastern Palace, or even like in the Oracles. The first dungeons are really short and very tutorial-based. I guess the first hour and a half of Twilight Princess is nothing but tutorials. But once you finally get to the dungeon, it's like a regular dungeon.
The dungeon crawling is like my favorite part of Zelda. So even though sometimes I get upset about Twilight Princess, maybe the dungeons being linear or something, it's maybe one of my favorite of the 3D games. In fact, the more we've talked about it in our videos and stuff, the more I'm like, yeah, I really like this game. Just because the characters and stuff, I actually think they address characters and side characters more than a lot of other Zelda games. As far as the dungeons go, I would say I do like going to that first dungeon, and not only is it dense, but there's a story that's told in that dungeon. Same thing with the Goron Mines. It's shorter, but it's still, like, for a second dungeon in a game, that's even still pretty dense.
Almost all of them have some sort of internal storyline, too. We talked about Snow Peak, we talked about the Forest Temple. That makes it more interesting to go through. I think in terms of games, Twilight Princess probably had the best dungeons. If we were rating games purely based on their dungeon quality, Twilight Princess might be the best one. Games like A Link to the Past have like 57 dungeons in them, but they're really short and small. That might just be because they're 2D games and they're quick to get through, I should say. That's not the case in Twilight Princess. And other games like Skyward Sword have very small dungeons when you look at just the pure number of rooms, but they're incredibly dense. Twilight Princess has these very large dungeons.
Well, we've talked about City in the Sky.
Yeah, I can't even mentally picture what that map looks like. And you know how good I am with maps.
True. What came to mind is Arbiter's Grounds, because you do this whole first portion that's similar to the Forest Temple in Ocarina of Time.
Yeah.
You get the pose. And the first time I played it, I thought, okay, we're now headed to the boss.
Halfway done, if that.
Yeah, and that's like one of the mid dungeons in the game. What do you think about the idea of it overusing the dungeon item in the dungeon?
We've talked about how Zelda's always about, well, you go to a dungeon, you get the dungeon item, oh, let's use that dungeon item against the boss. But when you actually look back at some old games, that's actually not often the case.
Okay.
Twilight Princess is the game that I think cemented you use the dungeon item. Every dungeon, it is required that you use the dungeon item to beat the boss. Like, I'm just like mentally going through them in my head. Every single one, other than I guess the Palace of Twilight, but I guess that's just the Master Sword.
Yeah, like in Arbiter's Grounds, once you get the spinner, it's like all spinner all the time.
Oh yeah, like the puzzles in the dungeon are the Dominion Rod in particular, the spinner, the double claw shot. Very heavy usage of the items. Some of those, it's like you use the spinner so much in that dungeon and then you virtually never use it outside the dungeon. Yeah. It's like a dungeon only weapon.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily opposed to using it a lot once you get it, because once you get an item, it's fun to use it. But then it kind of becomes a bummer when you only use it twice after that.
They're good items for the dungeons, but not outside. Mm-hmm. Games like A Link to the Past do it the best, where you get the Cane of Samurai or whatever, and then you can just use that as your regular weapon. You can't even use the Dominion Rod.
You can incorporate it into puzzles that you wouldn't think to.
Right, yeah.
Or you cannot.
Like, nobody's using the ball and chain in the overworld. I mean, you could. That's actually one of the ones you could use, but...
Alright, it's apples to oranges, but I think about Majora's Mask, where you get, you get like a bow and arrow item in every one, but there's also items you get, and then also the transformation masks. All the dungeons in that feel, I think, very unique. Like in Stone Tower Temple, you're going to use like the Deku mask.
Right.
If this was Twilight Princess,
That's
think
long
of
forgotten.
the slingshot.
Yeah, there's one treasure chest in the city in the sky that gives you slingshot ammunition. The oddest treasure chest ever. Because I don't think nobody playing that game has used the slingshot for at least 10 hours. Because you get the bow and arrow. And there's one treasure chest that gives you slingshot ammo, and I don't understand it. Why not just bombs or something? I don't know.
Maybe like, hey, you should have been using the slingshot. Well, yeah, that's our overall thoughts on the game. I think pretty positive towards the dungeons in that one.
And we probably could talk more in depth on a lot of these, but
Yeah.
we sort of just skimmed the surface. Some of them we didn't even talk about. But.
Yeah, I mean, we would probably do like a video per dungeon. Another potential series.
That one is a realistic one, though, because there's a lot to cover with each of these.
Those are our overall broad thoughts on the game. Leave us a comment, maybe tell us what ones you liked and why. Like, it'd be cool to see more specific reasons beyond the 10-minute discussion video. So leave us a comment with other topics you'd like us to discuss. We're always looking for new topics that people want to see us talk about. And thanks for watching.